On today's episode, I'm joined by Charlie Roumeliotis to break down all things Blackhawks through the first half of the season.
You're Locked On Blackhawks, your daily podcast on the Chicago Blackhawks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, Blackhawks fans? Welcome back to another episode of Locked On Blackhawks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Jack Bushman. Quick reminder off the top to go and smash that like button for me. Jump in the comment section down below. And last but certainly not least, subscribe to Locked On Blackhawks on YouTube if you haven't done so already. It's the best way that you can support the channel, and also go and ring that bell. Turn on the push notifications so that way you get notified whenever an episode is uploaded each and every day. All right, joining me today is none other than Chicago Blackhawks WGN Radio studio host Charlie Roumeliotis. It's been a little bit since we've last talked, Charlie, and I know there's been a little bit of update for you in terms of where you're at these days, so appreciate you taking the time to join me on today's episode. How's life treating you as we're battling through the cold here in Chicago, and also how's the new digs over at WGN going, my man?
Yeah, thank you for having me on. We're like biannual or semi.
Yes.
We do like 2 times a year. It feels like we try to do a mid-season check-in, then an off-season check-in. So we're kind of on schedule. So good to be back with you. It is bitterly cold out today. I woke up, I checked my phone, and it was like feels like temperature minus 24, and I was like, this is terrible. Why do we live in this city? But no, it's been good. New gig is going well too. I'm actually doing this from our WGN Radio office right before I do the Blackhawks live later tonight. So it's weird because NBC Sports Chicago is the only employer that I've ever worked for, and so going from NBC Sports Chicago to WGN Radio, I thought was going to be weird, but everyone at WGN Radio has been so welcoming and supportive of me joining their family that I have felt at home here since day one. And so that part of the transition has been incredibly smooth. And it has honestly allowed me to go into this new job feeling pretty comfortable. And it only took me, first game was a little bit disastrous for me. I don't like talking about it, but after that, like the few games after, once I started to get my bearings and kind of the ins and outs of how radio works, live radio, live TV, that has never been something I had been nervous about, but it's doing live radio, knowing like, okay, it's very precise, getting commercial reads and hey, at the top of the hour, we got to do a station ID, and the end of the Blackhawks post-game shows, it's like, you got to be out by this time. And so it's very like specific. And so getting all that in has been was a challenge at the beginning, but now it's second nature to me. So it's been fun.
Awesome. I'm glad to hear you've settled in, and I couldn't even imagine, dude, going back and listening to some of my first podcasts that I did on this show. Oh my God. I think I'd rather rip my hair out.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you've found your footing over there, and glad everything is going well for you at WGN Radio. Where I figure we'd start this conversation off, Charlie, there's a lot of different ways where we could steer this bad boy, but I figure we just go with a kind of broad overall current state of the Chicago Blackhawks, because last night, they fell 4-3 to the Carolina Hurricanes in overtime. That drops their record down to 15-28-4 through their opening 47 games. Technically, not last in the NHL standings, but tied with the San Jose Sharks for the fewest points. And a lot of Blackhawks fans are frustrated with, I think, not another losing season, because there weren't expectations for this team to go and make a playoff push or a run for the Stanley Cup playoffs or anything, but it's the amount of losing that's going on once again, and also kind of seemingly no real strides being made. So I figure we'd start this off, Charlie, with just kind of your expectations for the Blackhawks going into this season, and also your thoughts on the team through the first 47 games with those expectations in mind.
Yeah, it's a great question. And man, okay, so I rewind all the way back to last year's exit interviews where Kyle Davidson said, we have to go into next year. We're elevating our expectations, right? Like, we can't finish dead last in the NHL again. And so you take what he said and then you apply it going into this year, and you could see the offseason moves that they made. And it was Teuvo Teravainen and Tyler Bertuzzi and Pat Maroon and Craig Smith and acquiring Ilya Mikheyev, right? Then you make some of the additions on the back end and in goal with Alec Martinez and TJ Brody and Laurent Brossoit, who has still not participated in, I haven't really seen him around the rink, honestly, since the Winter Classic. So I don't even know if he's going to play at all this year. And so you see all the moves that they made, and you're like, okay. I was like, this looks like a respectable NHL team, right? Last year, if you look at last year's roster, somebody had tweeted, somebody had tweeted, forgive me. Did you see the tweet? I know
exactly what you're talking about, dude. The top pairing, I think, was Tenorti and Magna, dude.
Yeah, it was like January 7th roster last year. It was
without Bedard when he was hurt. Yeah. It was brutal, dude.
Oh my gosh. I was looking at the roster and I'm like, how many NHL players realistically are on that roster? I think I counted 5, like legitimately. And no disrespect to any of those players that were on, but I was like 5, maybe 6. And so I think you look at last year's roster and you're like, man, the Hawks roster last year was so thin. And then couple that with how many injuries they dealt with. Remember how at one point they had more money tied up in IR than they had on the active roster? It was like, geez, it was like, okay. So now you look at this year's roster. Come into training camp, you're like Teravainen, Bertuzzi, Mikheyev. You got some respectable top 9 pieces, top 6, whatever. And when they made the coaching change, so like fast forward to coaching change, like Hawks were dead last in the NHL. And so I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, okay, I was trying to compartmentalize. The organization elevated expectations going into the year. And so when they made the coaching change to fire Luke Richardson, I'm like, that makes sense because the organization wanted to elevate expectations and they find themselves still dead last in the standings. So if they didn't make a change, what would they have been telling to their fan base saying we expect higher expectations, not necessarily playoffs by any stretch, but let's take a step here. And so from that perspective, I got it from the organization's point of view. On the flip side, I was looking at some of the underlying stats. Like what was that stat that was going around? It was like 34 of the first 35 games of the season, the Hawks were leading, tied, trailing within 1 of every single third period. So it's like, man, last year it felt like a lot of the games were over by the second period.
Yeah.
So I really wrestled with. I was like, well, how much is a new coach going to get out of this group? Because I just think we got so used to how thin last year's roster was. And it feels like the upgrades that they made to this year's roster was so significant because it was like you're going from Teuvo Teravainen playing on the top line or from Tyler Johnson to Teuvo Teravainen. You're like, wow, that's a significant upgrade. But then you're thinking, well, Teravainen's probably more of a second line player on a good team, right? So it's like, I've really been wrestling with all of this like internally. And so do I think the Blackhawks are the worst team in the NHL? I don't think so. Do I think maybe we overvalued just how better this roster was compared to last year? I think it's definitely better, but relative to the other 31 NHL teams, I still think it's a long ways away. And so I really have to try to like reconcile the two of like the organization wanting to take steps forward, but also being a little bit realistic that it's like, I don't know if there are enough pieces on this roster yet to maybe hover more towards the middle of the pack of the bottom third teams.
It's funny that a lot of what you just said, I feel the same exact way about in terms of like wrestling with this team and the stat of 34, 35 games or whatever it was. The Blackhawks were within 1 tied or had the lead going into the third period. It's funny you say that because, you know, my good buddies know that I talk about the Blackhawks every single day and follow the Blackhawks, and they're Blackhawks fans too. But to be fair, you know, when they're not, their job isn't to watch the Blackhawks. They're not watching the Blackhawks very much when they're at the bottom of the standing. So they chirp me a bunch out of the gate when the Blackhawks were bad once again this year. And I'm like, listen, guys, like I'm telling them the stat. I'm like, they're not as bad as you really think they are, or as their record goes to show. And then, you know, Sorensen steps in, they win 3 games in a row. And I'm like, maybe we have something here. And then since then, it's kind of been one big step back. I think the Blackhawks have dropped 12 of their past 17 or something like that. But the biggest thing to probably happen to the Blackhawks in the first half of the season, Charlie, was the decision to fire Luke Richardson, which I don't think any of us anticipated to happen at that very point in time. Again, considering the expectations and where the Blackhawks were at in their rebuild. But to me personally, I understood why Kyle Davidson ultimately made that decision, because we were still losing games like we were the 2 seasons prior, and Connor Bedard had gotten off to a slow start to the season. Bertuzzi, Teravainen, the two big-name free agents that were brought in to help this offense, weren't really providing anything, and nothing was seemingly working. Richardson was throwing everything against the wall day after day. So I understood ultimately why Kyle Davidson made the decision, but I'm curious your thoughts on the decision to fire Luke Richardson at that very point in time. And, hindsight's always 2020, but your thoughts on the decision as we look at it now, considering, as I just mentioned, the Blackhawks have kind of taken a step back here.
Yeah. I got to be honest, when they made the coaching change, I was honestly surprised. Like,
Same.
I saw that come down and I was like, man, even after that loss to Boston. So just to peel back behind the curtain a little bit, the Hawks, I think they had sent out an email saying like there was going to be practice tomorrow at 11:30. And then it was like a follow-up like an hour later saying practice is canceled. And truly, I did not think anything of it. I was like, okay, cool. Like they just decided, hey, they need a rest day or whatever it is. Typically when you see that, you're like, uh-oh, it's like something's going down. And my mind never went there. My mind didn't even go there because I'm like, there's just no way that Luke Richardson's seat is relatively hot. I didn't think at the time, because if you rewind like a month, I think it was a month prior, like Kyle Davidson told Ben Pope of the Chicago Sun-Times saying like totally shutting down the Luke Richardson that his seat is warm. And so not only that, but like I went into this season, I'm like, things would have to get so bad for them to make a coaching change, because
Right.
This roster is just it's still not a great roster relative to the rest of the NHL. And so when they made the coaching change, I was like, wow, I'm really surprised by that. But then that's where that's where the tension comes in of, okay, well, how long can this go before, like when they made the coaching change, was it November? Was it December?
It was December. First week of December, right after they lost to Boston.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, first week of December. And so it was like, okay, well, we're still like 2 months into the season. You got 4.5 months left or whatever it is. So it's like, how much did they stumble out of the gate where you're like, Bedard is struggling. Tyler Bertuzzi had been invisible for the first month of the season. They've been close in games, but they weren't finding ways to win. They were finding ways to lose. And so that was like
more than 2 goals.
Exactly. And they were leaning on a like really elite goaltending, because I think at the time under Luke, they had like a top 10 save percentage. Ironically, under Sorensen, they have like one of the worst team save percentages. So it's very weird. And we're seeing more blowouts under Sorensen, but they're playing more I don't know what's going on, honestly, sometimes. So when I saw that come in, I was like, wow. I was like, I'm a little surprised by this. And but like I saw both sides. I saw organization is like, well, what message are we sending to the fan base that we're elevating expectations and the results are the same? Now maybe the results are the same, like standings wise, but you can see within the games, you're like, they're competitive, like they're competitive in every single game. They're just finding ways to lose. And so that's where I think Kyle Davidson looked at it and was like, okay, maybe he didn't expect a coaching change to like elevate this group into like a playoff team or whatever, but he's probably like, maybe a coach would change to where instead of finding ways to lose, we'll find ways to push games into overtime and get that extra point, get that extra 2 points, and find ways to steal games. And maybe that would be the case if the Hawks had gotten the same goaltending that they were getting under Richardson, but they haven't. Yeah. And so now it's like they're losing games in some like 5-1, 5-2. And it's like, well, we didn't see that under Luke this year. And so that's where it's been like a weird struggle. Here's what I will say. I think under Sorensen, they're a lot more prepared. Practices are way more efficient. There has been a benefit. You see Tyler Bertuzzi has been one of the best Blackhawks over the last couple months.
Definitely.
Connor Bedard has been awesome over the since the coaching change. So there have been benefits to this, but it's gonna be really interesting to see when they open up this coaching search in the summer, which guys are available and which coaches would see this Blackhawks job as an appealing destination now. Like, because if you got through the year with Luke Richardson and then you go into next year, I think it would have been his final year of his deal. Like, I think it was a team option. So they would have maybe given
been weird. That would have been weird too.
Yeah. But if you went into next year with Luke as the coach, then you decide, like whatever, if midway through that season, you're like, well, we're trending in the wrong direction, then you make that coaching change and you open it up in the summer of 2026, then you might have a coach that would, I don't know, if like Mike Sullivan became available or whoever, that's like, okay, Hawks look almost ready to roll because now the younger guys are here in the NHL or whatever, they've turned pro. So now I'm going to be really interested to see the appetite for this job because it still is one of the best jobs in hockey. When this team is winning and competitive, it's legitimately one of the best jobs in the NHL. I just wonder how much it will be appealing to an experienced potential NHL head coach that would want to come here maybe a year or two earlier to try to help elevate this young group.
I have some questions that we'll get to on potentially the next Blackhawks head coach in just a moment, Charlie. Final question that I have for you before we take a quick break. Were you as frustrated as I was that under Luke Richardson, Tyler Bertuzzi did not play whatsoever with Connor Bedard? It just never made any sense to me whatsoever, man. You bring Bertuzzi in. It's the biggest contract that Kyle Davidson has given out as a general manager. He's a power forward. Connor Bedard, as a rookie, played his best with Nick Foligno on the wing, who's kind of like no disrespect to Nick Foligno, but at this stage of his career, a diet version of what Tyler Bertuzzi brings to the table. I was pounding hand and fist on my desk, man, throughout the first quarter of the season. Why is Tyler Bertuzzi not playing with Connor Bedard? And now to see them have success with one another, it's like almost even double infuriating that. Why was this guy not playing on the top line right from the get-go? I know he's a notorious slow starter and he was bad early on in the year, but legitimately, like, everyone offensively at that point in time was bad. And he had tried like everything except that. I just didn't understand that whatsoever.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. And Bedard and Bertuzzi were together during training camp for almost all of camp. And so then the day before opening night, they just went away from it. And I don't know if they saw, I mean, to be fair, they didn't really light up the preseason together. So it wasn't like Bedard and Bertuzzi had this great chemistry and it was like, well, what are we doing here? So I don't know if they just didn't like what they were seeing in the preseason and they're like, okay, let's change this up going into the regular season. But it was weird that the first month and a half or whatever it was, like, Bedard seemingly played with every single forward but Bertuzzi. And that's not an exaggeration. It was like Donato, Kurashev, Teravainen, Mikheyev, Foligno, like Dick. I mean, it was so many, and it was like everyone but Bertuzzi. And I was just like, what's going on here? And so, yeah, from that standpoint, it was a little puzzling. And but I will say this, Bertuzzi got off to such a slow start that there were games the first month of the season where I was like, did Bertuzzi play today? Like, I didn't even notice him. And that was kind of the start that he had in Toronto last year, where it was really slow. And then he didn't pick up his play towards the second half. And then it was the playoffs where you saw him make the impact, because that's the style of game that he thrives in. Like, it's hard for him, the way he plays. Playing that in October, he's probably like, you got to be kidding me. Like, can you just get to some meaningful games? Like,
so true.
You know what I mean? So it is a marathon. And so you do have to, when you play that grindy physical style, you go to the dirty areas, you really do have to like mentally and physically prepare for the rigors of an 82 game season. And so maybe he's just historically a slow starter because it takes him a while to like actually feel like the hockey season's here and like let me get engaged. Like, we're in the heart of the season now, and he's been terrific. But yeah, it was a little puzzling at the time where it's like, man, why? It's the one guy he hasn't played with, and it's like the one guy that you see the Hawks sign over the summer that you're like, that's a guy that should be playing with Connor Bedard. And so I think the Bertuzzi, Bedard, Teravainen, that trio, they've been on the ice together for only 5 minutes all season long at 5-on-5. And like, it's those 5 minutes are like by accident. It was like, oh, like they overlapped shifts. Like on a shift. Yeah. So it's like at some point I would like to see them together, but I do like Bertuzzi, Bedard together, and Nazar has been excellent on that line. So I don't bring it up just yet, but at some point I'm going to be bringing that up again to put that trio together.
We'll be getting to Frank Nazar here in just a minute, Charlie. We'll be back in just a second, Blackhawks fans, to talk more about Frank Nazar and some thoughts on the next Blackhawks head coach. But first, real quick, I do got to talk to you all about Select Quote. In sports, having a winning strategy is everything. It's how the best teams make it to the Super Bowl, the World Series, and the Olympics, and the same goes for life. Having a strategy like life insurance from SelectQuote can protect your financial legacy and keep your family's financial future secure. And SelectQuote makes it easy to find the perfect life insurance policy. As one of America's leading insurance brokers with nearly 40 years of experience, they've helped over 2 million customers find $700 billion worth of coverage since 1985. And what specifically sets SelectQuote apart is their personal touch. Unlike other brokers that offer one-size-fits-all policies, their licensed agents tailor coverage to fit your specific, unique needs. So to go and get the right life insurance for you, tongue twister there, for less, go check out SelectQuote.com/LockedOnNHL. Again, that's SelectQuote.com/LockedOnNHL in all caps today to get started. SelectQuote. They shop, you save. All right, back here on the Locked On Blackhawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Segment 2, picking up the conversation where we left off. Charlie, we know the next head coaching hire for the Chicago Blackhawks is going to be a very crucial one to steer this rebuild in the proper direction. And one specific name that's been thrown out there by a lot of Blackhawks fans and even from some notable hockey sources has been the current coach of the Denver Pioneers, and David Carl, who's coming off of his second gold medal as the head coach of the United States at the World Junior Championship. He's also a 2-time national champion head coach for the Denver Pioneers. And oh yeah, the guy's only 35 years old. He's racked up a really impressive resume at a young age. It feels like there are going to be many NHL teams interested in David Carl. We know he's not going to be coaching the United States for next year's World Junior, so seems like he's probably ready to make that transition to the NHL. But should the Blackhawks go that direction, Charlie, that would make the third first-time NHL hire for the Chicago Blackhawks. And I do love David Carl, and I think it's an incredible resume and much different than the last two first-time NHL head coaches here for the Blackhawks. But it does still feel like they'd probably want someone with some experience. So I'm really curious your thoughts on David Carl as a potential head coach, and then also some other guys you could potentially want the Blackhawks to be interested in for this job.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating question because I'll say this, whatever happens with this coaching search, I think the organization thinks extremely highly of Anders Sorensen, that whether he's gets the permanent gig or not, I think he's going to stay inside the organization. And so I think like compartmentalizing that versus, okay, what are the options for Chicago if they open this up or when they open this up over the summer? And I agree with you. It would be, someone would really have to sweep you off your feet to not go the route of an experienced NHL coach, because the Hawks went from Joel Quenneville to Jeremy Colleton, first-year head coach. And then when Colleton was relieved of his duties, Derek King stepped in the interim, first-year head coach. Then the Hawks end up hiring Luke Richardson, first-year NHL head coach. He gets relieved of his duties. Anders Sorensen gets promoted, first-year NHL head coach. So it's been a lot of, they've gone to the same well the last few years. And so I think if you want to take the next step as an organization, and especially if you want to start competing for playoffs and Stanley Cups, I think it's rare to find the next John Cooper or the next Jared Bednar, where it's like the young guys that can grow with the organization, and then they end up turning out to be a home run hires, right? With David Carl, I think he is as respected of a coach in college and even in the NHL. I'm sure he's going to get that opportunity. For Chicago, I'm not sure if the fit is there relative to where the Hawks are trying to get to. Like, I think he would have been a great hire a couple years ago to transition this team into a rebuild and develop some of the younger players. Is he the guy you want where you want to take the next step to get into the playoffs? I'm not sure, because I think he could do a great job doing it, but there's too much of an unknown there, right, that I'm not sure you can take that risk of going down that route. And so it's really challenging, because you definitely don't want to dismiss it, or maybe he'll even get an interview, a second interview, whatever, and you really do your research when it comes to that. I think another thing that I think has been a challenge for the Chicago coaching staff over the last several years is the assistant coaches have also had a lot of inexperience. So when Jeremy Colleton gets hired to be the permanent head coach for the Blackhawks, he brings over Sheldon Brookbank and Thomas Mattel, and it's like those guys, that was their first times being assistant NHL head coaches or assistant coaches right in the NHL. And then, when Derek King, when Luke Richardson gets the job, it's like Derek King, Derek Plant are on his staff. Kevin Dean, very well respected. He's done a great job with the defense, but it's like there's a lot of inexperience on the coaching staff as a whole. And I think that actually probably played a role too in Luke Richardson, because his personality is like laid back, kind of a player's coach, right? And so there's not really like tough cop. There aren't really a bunch of tough cops on the coaching staff to kind of counteract some of the personalities, right? And so, and that's not to say that is in a bad way, because I think King and Plant, like they're great, right? Like Derek King, we saw obviously the as an interim coach, and he elevated that group to what they should have been, right? And so, but I think if you want to go down the route of getting a guy that can help you get to playoff and Stanley Cup contention, a guy like David Carl probably was going to bring in his own guys, and they might not be experienced NHL guys, and so it's like it's just a risk. And so, but it is going to be fascinating to see who gets interviewed for this job and who becomes available at the end of the season, where maybe a respected name that we're not thinking about shakes loose, and it's like, oh, that guy would be a good fit. Like, I know this is a pipe dream, it feels like, but Mike Sullivan, like if he became available, I mean, I would give him a blank check, and I don't know if he would even want to come here. I will say he was the development coach for the Blackhawks in 2015 when they won their third Stanley Cup. So their third of the dynasty era. So it could be kind of a reuniting with Norm MacIver and Kyle Davidson, but Pittsburgh also has to relieve him of his duties if he wants to, if they want that to happen. So he would be the ideal guy in my opinion, but I just don't know if he's going to become available.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating to see who is going to be interviewed and who ultimately the Blackhawks do wind up deciding upon, because as I alluded to, I think it's going to be very instrumental in any success that they want to have. They got to get this head coaching hire right, similar to what the Chicago Bears have been going through. We hope that's going to be the case with Ben Johnson moving forward. Hope the Chicago Blackhawks are able to get a slam dunk hire for their next head coach as well. Charlie, believe it or not, we're 25 minutes through this bad boy, and we have not talked about number 98 Connor Bedard. That honestly probably deserves a round of applause from us. Our audience, the true Blackhawks fans who are sick of Connor Bedard probably being jammed down their throat, are probably like, wow, that is some awesome Blackhawks dialogue going on. But we got to get to the kid. Bedard, of course, caught some flack early on in the season, getting off to the slow start. As we mentioned earlier, kind of the entire Blackhawks offense got off to a slow start. But, at the beginning of the year, Macklin Celebrini's going on a nice run. Of course, when the Blackhawks play the Philadelphia Flyers, who scores the overtime winner? Oh, it's Matvei Michkov, baby. It's like, what else could possibly go wrong? But Bedard has woken up over the last month or so, particularly since Sorensen has taken over and since Tyler Bertuzzi's been bumped up to the top line. Now got 41 points through 47 games on the year. Just kind of take me through what you've seen from Connor Bedard here through his sophomore season. I'm sure we've both mentioned on our shows, the accolades, 100 points in 112 games. But just take me through what you've liked and also kind of maybe some critiques, because I'm sure there has been some of that along the way. We saw kind of a bad turnover last night against Carolina. Listen, he's a 19-year-old kid. He's not perfect. But give me your assessment of Connor Bedard so far in his second NHL campaign, Charlie.
Yeah, I know for him, he had that really tough stretch during the season where he went 12 games without a goal. And I remember the first 4 or 5 games of that drought, he was getting 4 shots on goal, 7 shot attempts. You're like, okay, he's fine. The chances are going to come, or the goals are going to come. But if you look at the second half of that 12-game goal drought, it was 0 shots, 1 shot attempt. It was 1 shot on goal, 2 shot attempts. It was like, oh boy, it's like now the chances aren't coming. And so that's when you kind of sound the alarm bells. And for him, I think he came into this season with such higher expectations of himself for 2 reasons. One, It's like you got a full season under your belt as a rookie, and it was a chaotic rookie season. It's like everywhere he went, it was a media circus. Just look at that opening road trip. It was like, man,
God.
this poor kid.
Gauntlet.
Oh man, this poor kid has been putting up respectable numbers while also dealing with so many off-ice distractions of just being pulled in so many different directions and wanting to be marketed like the NHL should, right? And the Blackhawks. But I'm sure it was a lot for an 18-year-old kid. And so this summer, he was joking around with us during training camp the first day. He's like, man, I don't think I did a media interview in like 4 months. He's like, it was so freeing. And, and so it's like, man, you never don't really think about it. But like the previous summer, it was, scouting combine, getting ready for the draft. You go to the draft, then the top prospects fly to Florida for the Stanley Cup final. They're doing tours or whatever, get drafted, fly to Chicago for development camp. Then you're doing all these marketing. It is a lot. And so for him, he's probably like, I didn't get a chance to work on my game as much as I wanted to last summer, the first summer going into his first NHL season, because he had so many obligations. And so this year he was able to spend most of the summer in Vancouver, just quiet, away from everything, didn't have to do media, didn't have to be bothered by anyone. And so when he comes into the season and the numbers weren't there as an individual, like personally for him, he was probably like, what is going on here? Like, I'm really frustrated. And I think we saw the first glimpse of that when they had that homecoming game in Vancouver, and he was on the after hours show with Scott Oak, and he was like, it's been really tough mentally. And it was like that was the first time you heard like Connor be like, okay, confidence is taking a little bit of a hit. Mentally, he's confused as to like why this isn't going the way he expected it to. But over the last few weeks under Sorensen, like points in whatever it is, 12 of 13 games or 13 of 14, whatever it is. And he went on that 9-game point streak as well. So like he is back. The area where like he's legitimately one of the best players in the NHL as far as zone entries. Like he's so good at that. But then you see it the play that he makes the other night where he turns the puck over at the blue line, shorthanded goal the other way, and it kind of ignites Carolina's comeback. And so that's kind of like, okay, I was thinking, I'm like, well, what should he have done there? Should he have dumped the puck in? But then it's like that takes away from his strength of like being a guy that,
and the team strength. They're not good at that. Exactly.
And it's like, oh, by the way, the defenseman that did that, Jacob Slavin, probably the best defensive defenseman in the NHL, who has got the longest reach, So it's like, it's one of those things. Yeah, exactly. So it's one of those things where it's like, you don't want to coach the creativity out of him. But it's also like trying to find that balance of like making sure, like more sure than normal, that it's not going to lead to an odd man rush the other way. And so he's been great. The lately, like the last few weeks, I mean, he's just, it feels like I'm tweeting out clips of him every night where it's like, oh, what a pass to Frank Nazar, and Nazar gets robbed. And it's like, well, that should have been a point. Or, Bedard fires it from the it was like the corner, hits the crossbar, almost like puts it through a tight window, and it's like, oh man, like that should have been a point, whatever. It's like, man, he could have so many more points than he does. And so I think once the roster starts to get better, you're going to see guys finish that. Or what was a play the other day? I think it was the Vegas game, the 2-on-1 where he had with Tyler Bertuzzi, and like Bertuzzi just fires it over the net. It's like, oh my goodness. Right. It's like, that was Patrick Kane. Like Patrick Kane buries it, or like whoever. And like the Nashville play too, where he had that spinorama pass to Bertuzzi. It's like nasty. Yeah, it's like those plays he makes, and it's like he will get guys that will finish those plays down the road. And so it's just like, hang on to that if you're a Chicago fan, because you know that once there are legit NHL players that are finishers, like those pucks will go in.
1,000%. The only real criticisms I have about Bedard are in terms of being better at deciding when he can have those moments of when he can be aggressive, right? When you're up 2-0 on the power play against Carolina, you have an opportunity to go ahead 3-0. You just can't make that type of play to give them wind in their sails. And I know you broke it down perfectly. It's Jacob Slavin. Like those things are going to happen. And I am being nitpicky, but we have seen those types of moments where it's like, okay, sometimes you do got to do a better job of recognizing this is when you can force things and try to do it yourself, or this is just one of those where you got to make the smarter play ahead. Other than that, the only real worry I have about Bedard is he's kind of getting knocked off the puck a little bit too easily, I think, but that does come with the lack of size. But other than that, Charlie, legitimately, I have no concerns about this kid whatsoever. And any criticism that was thrown his way, I think the only reason he would be criticized is because of the expectations that came with him coming into this league, because legitimately every other player on the Chicago Blackhawks team, as you probably know, watching this team every single night, there are so many other guys that deserve more criticism than Connor Bedard. Like, for people to be pointing the finger at this kid, it's like, oh my goodness, you should have seen Tyler Bertuzzi the first month of the season. Like, you could have had eight pages full of notes. So I really have no concerns. And I think we do all forget, the kid's 19 years old, still the second youngest player in the NHL, nearly a point per game player. And there was a great tweet of all the first overall picks since Patrick Kane, I believe in 2007, of their points per game as a teenager. And he's legitimately ahead of everyone except for Connor McDavid and Sidney Crosby. So I'm sorry he's not at Connor McDavid and Sidney Crosby level, two of the biggest outliers and greatest players of all time. Other than that, no concerns whatsoever, Charlie.
What's funny is, like, he was technically eligible to play in the World Juniors for Team Canada this year.
Right.
Like, that's how young he still is. And as a 17-year-old, 2 years ago is when he put up that epic tournament, 23 points in 7 games. And it was like, geez, he could have literally represented Team Canada in the World Juniors. And so, yeah, no concerns. I will say this. I do think the turnovers are valid, or like getting pushed off the puck. That's valid. And I don't know if that has anything much to do with his strength, because man, if you look at his legs are tree trunks. Like, they are
working. He's working.
Yeah, I think the thing for me, he gets knocked off because he doesn't have he's not the greatest skater. Like, he doesn't blow by guys. He uses actually his strength to try to like shield himself, but he's not like a McDavid or McKinnon or even Patrick Kane, like, had speed, like where you can just kind of like fly around guys. And so when you see him kind of at the blue line trying to like get by guys, he's not going to pull away with his speed. He's going to do it with his edge work, where he just like breaks really quick, then like turns the other way, and it's like, whoa, he just made the guy break his ankles. And so that's how he's going to use his strengths. But yeah, I think, like, I saw the stat going around the other day that was like he's the fastest player to 100 points since Crosby. It's like, what are we doing here? Like, I think he's going to be okay.
Another talented young player that's been on the NHL scene with the Blackhawks these last few weeks, guy you mentioned a handful of minutes ago, Charlie, Frank Nazar, been on the top line with Connor Bedard and Tyler Bertuzzi these last few games. I think he's fit in marvelously there. And what stood out to me in particular, Charlie, is not only the amount of chances that Frank Nazar gets. I mean, he legitimately could have double-digit points. And I tweeted out last night, like, he's going to have a 3-point game one of these nights. He is on the edge of that. But what stood out to me, not only the amount of chances that he's got, is the amount of plays he makes himself with his speed and his forechecking ability. Despite him being like 5'9", 5'10", he's battling out there, and he will take the puck away from you, and he plays with an edge out there, and I love that, along with Connor Bedard.
That's one of the things the organization really loves about him, is not just his speed, but he is competitive. Like, he's a guy that will go to the dirty areas. He will work to go get the puck. And the thing I've appreciated him playing with Bedard on the wing is that he does not look timid or he is like, they clicked instantly. Like, hey, you got me, I got you. Let's play this game. Let's have some fun. And it's like they're playing pond hockey together. It's like how much fun they're having playing on a line together. And it's like, I think they were put together in that Nashville game, and it was like instantly they were creating chances. I was like, okay, all right, this could work. And for me, like, there was a clip yesterday that Frank Nazar was hunting down a puck from his own zone, and his top speed got so fast that I was like, okay, I knew he was fast. I didn't know he was that fast. And
I actually posted was nuts.
It was crazy.
He flew,
I got home.
Dude.
I got home from the game last night, and I was like, let me go back and watch that. Like, was I overblowing that or whatever? And I was like, dude, it's actually faster than I thought when I saw that. And so I ended up looking it up on NHL Edge. There's a stat there's a website that tracks the top speed, and they had him clocked that specific play at 23.8 .07 miles per hour. And I think McDavid's top speed this year is like 23.9 miles per hour. So it's like he was 0.9 off from McDavid. And it was just like, geez. And so I honestly think he probably could have gotten faster if he didn't dive. Like if he had like a few more strides in him, I feel like he probably could have flirted with 24 miles per hour. But when I saw that, I was like, this is a guy, and he's just scratching the surface. I was like, he's gonna maybe get a little bit faster, and it's like him on a line with Connor Bedard for at least the short term. I think they could work, and then if it ends up being a line that they can play off each other in the long term, great. But like, I love them together. And you mentioned his speed too, his forechecking. I think that's why he's on the penalty kill. Yeah. Like he had 2 shorthanded goals in Rockford, and he had that shorthanded chance against Nashville where it was like a breakaway opportunity, and he tried going 5-hole. UC Saros stops it, but I'm like, man, his speed is such a threat that it's brilliant that the Blackhawks are putting him on the penalty kill this early, because it's like he can potentially pounce on some loose pucks and create some of these shorthanded scoring opportunities.
Yeah, and what I love too, Charlie, is, and this is how I've put it, at least on my show, the Blackhawks don't need Frank Nazar to be a center. They don't need Frank Nazar to be a wing. They need him to be a player, and it looks like he can be a player that can impact the game in a whole lot of ways. Super excited to watch him the rest of the way. I also wanted to bring up your thoughts on Lukas Reichel, who's kind of been utilized strictly in a bottom 6 role for the Blackhawks this year, mostly at the center ice position, which in his couple of prior years, at least when he had been up with the Blackhawks, he had found most of his success on the wing. Personally, it's not the way that I would have handled Lukas Reichel going into the season, especially when he has the speed and skill to help out this offense that was like in dire need of help in those areas for a long, long time. But as I've kind of put it on my show, I'm not going to sit here and act like I know more than the Blackhawks coaching staff or front office, right? And I'm sure there was a reason they wanted him in the bottom 6 to play with a little bit more of an edge. And it's not the way I personally would have gone about it, but I can see why maybe they would have gone that way. But I'm just curious your thoughts on the handling of Lukas Reichel so far this year.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a fascinating one too, because the goal he scores the other night against Vegas, I was like, wow. I was like, that can he do that more? It's like
it's the pointing. It's who was it? Leo. It's Leo pointing.
Yes.
That.
Yeah. Pointing at the screen. It's like that. If he can do that more, it's like that's exactly the kind of potential that his ceiling could be in the NHL, like making those kinds of plays. And it's just I asked Connor Bedard that specifically about Reichel's at morning skate yesterday. I was like, you look at the goal that he scored the other day. Like when you see that, I mean, how excited does that get you? But also like what his ceiling could be in the NHL. And I've never seen Connor gush over a player more than he's gushed over Lukas Reichel when he is on. And he was like, that guy absolutely flies. Like I don't know how he does it. His brain works. His hands catch up with his brain. It's like rare to see that kind of talent. And I was just like, okay, that's the ceiling, right? Like if he can just get closer to there. And the amount of times I've watched a Blackhawks game this year where I'm like, wow, Reichel was noticeable. Like he was flying through the neutral zone puck. And then I look at the score sheet after the game and I was like
11:30.
Yeah, it was like 11:30, like 1 shot on goal and 2 shot attempts. I was like, I don't know if my eyes were deceiving me or if it was just like, I think he does those plays where he flashes, but it's like the finish isn't there.
Right.
Or he's setting guys up. And if you're on the 4th line, you're not going to be playing with finishers, right? But here's what I'll say. I think like during training camp, the Hawks gave Reichel every opportunity to seize control of a top 6 role.
He did not have a good preseason.
And he didn't have a good preseason. And so that's why I think he's like, okay, because I can't remember who said it, whether it was Davidson or Luke Richardson at the time of training camp. And it was like, Reichel's not a 4th line player. Like you're just not going to put him on the 4th line, right? Well, then like 2 months into the year, it's like, he's on the 4th line. But they did that because he didn't take advantage of his opportunity in the top 6. And so then he goes from being a healthy scratch into, okay, got to put you on the 4th line because you got to earn your way back into a top 6 or top 9 role. And he just hasn't quite done that. And so it's going to be really interesting to see what the organization does with him as the trade deadline approaches, because it's like sometimes you see the plays that he makes, like against Vegas, the goal, and it's like, man, he teases you with that. And it's like, oh my goodness, can he do that more often? Because if he does that, that's a player that could be here long term. But they can't have a stretch where Reichel goes a significant amount of time without producing, because then it's like, well, he's not really impacting the game in other ways if he's not scoring. And so that's where there's some tension. And so I personally would not trade Lukas Reichel just to get rid of him.
Same.
But if there's an opportunity where you're like, okay, we've made up our mind that it's just not going to work out here, then you kind of wrestle with, okay, when can we get the most value? Is it going to be this year, or is it going to be in the summer? Is it going to be next year when he continues to elevate his game or whatever? I'm not sure, but it's going to be interesting to see how they handle him.
And he's also not a Kyle Davidson draft pick, right? And
Right.
Kyle Davidson probably looks at a lot of the forwards that he selected over the last handful of years, and this is at least something I've talked about on the show. He maybe doesn't envision Lukas Reichel as a top 6 puzzle piece long-term here. So maybe that's why he's trying to give him some reps in the bottom 6. And I think you actually brought up a great point about him not taking advantage of that opportunity during the preseason. But I'm in the same boat. I wouldn't trade Lukas Reichel just to trade him. I think it would honestly be a little bit of a shame to trade him this early without giving him that opportunity to kind of truly know what type of player he is, because quite honestly, in a lost season like this, like, we at least might as well find out, right? That's
Yeah.
what I go to at the end of the day. We'll see what winds up happening with Lukas Reichel. I do like that he's at least on his way up in the lineup, playing with Colton Dach and Nick Foligno. I do think gives him a better opportunity to have some of the finished product ability with those guys who have some more offensive upside. And speaking of the trade deadline, Charlie, we're winding down here. I know you got a show you're coming up in a little bit, but trade deadline is right around the corner. Figure the Blackhawks are going to be part of it once again. We heard Taylor Hall kind of be outspoken about his future here in Chicago not all that long ago in the media. His contract's coming up. Ryan Donato's a really interesting one that expires at the end of the year as well. And then there's Pat Maroon, Craig Smith, and Alec Martinez on the back end as well. What do you kind of expect out of the Blackhawks at this year's trade deadline?
Yeah, I imagine Taylor Hall is going to be the guy that is likely moved out. It is going to be interesting to see how they handle the cap situation with that, because is there going to be, obviously there's going to be salary retention, but is there going to need to be double retention to get a second or the second team involved, a third party broker to crunch the number down even more? I'm not sure. The difficult part for me is I'm not really sure how busy the Blackhawks can be, mainly because I'm not really sure what they're going to be able to, like, what is it worth trading Pat Maroon for 5th round pick or whatever? It's like, what, I don't know, like that you'd almost rather keep him through the rest of the year.
I think the bigger one is Donato. Like, why trade Ryan Donato? Like, he's been good. Like,
yeah.
And I know we're not really like worried about winning games here, but like, do you really want to be losing more? Because trading Ryan Donato probably puts you in jeopardy of that.
Right. And it's a great point too, because you don't want to go into the last month and whatever it would be, probably 6 weeks of the season where, you know, you trade Donato or you trade Maroon and you trade Taylor Hall. And now you're like, they don't have any NHL players again. This looks like last year's roster. Right. And so it is this kind of balance. And I'm not sure, you know, I think if they had players on their roster that could fetch a 1st or a 2nd round pick, that's a different story. But any player that's probably like a 3rd or beyond, it's like, you know, I don't know, like, yeah, might as well just keep them at that point. And so you'd rather them finish out the season strong or whatever the case may be. So I'm honestly not expecting fireworks from Chicago, unless, I'm not putting this out there like as if it's but like, unless the Hawks feel like there are guys available that they could add that could be potential pieces for them moving forward, where you're like, okay, some of these Stanley Cup contenders or playoff contenders are trying to move guys out and they're trying to bring in more established NHL players, then you could maybe take a chance on a flyer on the young guy or whatever the case may be, a guy that could be locked up long term. And you're like, okay, that's a guy that we can see in our rebuild. But as far as selling wise, I just don't know if there's much value on Chicago's roster.
Right. And like, do they even really need like a 3rd round pick? You know, like, is that even really going to get them over the hump when they have as deep of a prospect pool as they do? So I'm in the same boat. I don't really see them being huge sellers. Charlie, I promise this is the last question I have for you. I forgot to ask it earlier. I got to ask about the Laurent Brossoit situation. I know you said you haven't seen him since the Winter Classic. We don't have any update whatsoever. The meniscus is a whole thing, but even not just Brossoit, there's the whole thing with Arvid Soderblom as well, because now that he's played 60 NHL games, he's not waiver exempt. He'll have to go through waivers to go to Rockford, and I'm sure the Blackhawks wouldn't want to risk losing him for free as good as he's looked this season. Brossoit and Mrazek are under contract through the end of next. Like, this is a conundrum, and I don't know truly how you get out of it if you're the Chicago Blackhawks. Like, do you trade Peter Mrazek? Do you just cut ties with Laurent Brossoit before he plays a game for your organization? Like, what do you think happens here, man? Because I have no idea, truthfully.
Yeah, well, here's the good news, I guess, is I don't think it's going to be a problem that they have to deal with this season.
Right. And
I just don't.
That might be a good thing, right? As tough as that is for Brossoit, like, that
for
would have
sure,
been a big problem for them to have to deal with right now.
Yeah, I think it would have been really interesting if it was a situation where Brossoit is like ready to return now, because now it's like, well, what do? You're going to run 3 goalies until the end of April? I'm not sure you could do that. It's just unfair to all the goalies. And so I think if it was like, oh, Brossoit is ready to return by, I don't know, like March, and it's like, okay, 5 weeks left in the season, you can get by with 3 goalies. Like, you can figure it out, right? But the alarming part, I guess, for me with Brossoit is that, remember when he had the first surgery and he was approaching that 7-week timetable, and he was skating for a while, and then we just didn't see him for like a week. And I was like, okay, what's going on here? And Luke Richardson had said at the time, he was like, I think it's like similar to what Thatcher Demko is going through in Vancouver. And it was like, oh, that's not good, because Demko took him like 9 months to get back. Like, it was a long time. Like, he hadn't played since the playoffs. And so it had something to do with like some cartilage issue or whatever, I think, is where like you have the surgery and then it's just like not recovering properly, whatever the case might be. I saw Brossoit at the Winter Classic. He participated in the family skate, but I have not seen him like at the rink. I see him like occasionally, but I haven't seen him like skating on his own or like doing work or whatever the case may be. So I would honestly, at this point, I would be a little surprised if he returned, but this season. But it is going to be a fascinating discussion going into the summer, because I don't know if you can, even if Brossoit is ready to go by next season or by the summer. I mean, he hasn't played in a full year. And so I don't know if you can be like, okay, let's get rid of Mrazek, or let's trade Soderblom or whatever. And because we're good to go, because like it might flare up again. You just don't know.
Also, he's missed a ton of time in his career. Like, not only this year, I don't think he's ever played more than 22 NHL games in a season.
Yeah, exactly. And so given what, I think the decision would have been a little easier if Soderblom regressed again.
Right.
But because he's played much better this year, it's like, okay, you can't get rid of a young goalie that may or may not be a piece long term. I think that's still up in the air, but you can't trade him without finding out whether he is that guy or could be that guy. And so it's going to be interesting to see how they handle this situation. And obviously they're going into the final year of Peter Mrazek's deal next year. And so that is probably, you approach next year's trade deadline, and that's probably a scenario where you can maybe offload Mrazek or whatever. But because we haven't seen Brossoit yet, I don't even know if it's even possible that he's going to return this year, because it's probably not going to be a problem that the Hawks are going to have to deal with this year. It's probably more of an offseason question.
I hope Kyle Davidson's probably just like pushing that down the road. Like, we'll worry about that one.
Kick that can.
Exactly. Charlie, I've taken up enough of your time this afternoon, my man. I really appreciate you joining me for the show. Thank you very much. Looking forward to our next chat, my man.
Absolutely. No apologies necessary. I love talking Blackhawks with you. And so hopefully we'll do it again soon, whether that's the end of the season or off season, as we look ahead to some of the draft and free agency and all that stuff. So it was great to catch up with you.
Absolutely. I'll do my best to try to get you back on right around April, end of the season, to kind of tie a bow on the 2024-2025 campaign. But thank you again, Charlie. Thank you to everyone who tuned into today's episode of Locked On Blackhawks. I'm sure I have a ton of crossover audience with Charlie and his Blackhawks Breakaway podcast, but if you somehow don't already subscribe and follow that, make sure to check out the Blackhawks Breakaway podcast. Make sure to subscribe to Locked On Blackhawks on YouTube as well if you somehow are watching at this point in today's video and don't already subscribe to the channel. I'll catch you next time on the Locked On Blackhawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.